thinking with you together this afternoon about menstrual temporality, cyclic bodies in a linear world. So in this paper, I want to explore a phenomenology of the menstrual cycle, focusing on the cycle's rhythm as a form of lived temporality. Work on the menstrual cycle is relatively underexplored in philosophical and specifically phenomenological work, which is my background as a philosopher. There's some exceptions. Simone de Beauvoir and Iris Marion Young both reflect on the experience of menstruation. However, both cases and others like them are focused on menstruation itself rather than the menstrual cycle as a whole. So such work tends to focus on the lived experience of the menstrual bleed and the experience of, for example, shame or taboo or transgression that can involve. I've got a different focus here. I want to think about the phenomenology of the menstrual cycle as a whole. So the lived experience of cycling through the embodied experience of pre-ovulation, ovulation, pre-menstruation and menstruation. And want to consider something of what it's like of the subject who cycles through those 4 quadrants of lived experience as a pattern, or specifically an embodied rhythm that constitutes a form of lived temporality. And I also want to consider, in terms of giving you a little map of where we're going, I want to consider a way that the subject can be alienated from this rhythm as a result of a dominant cultural narrative of and that's a clash, a tension that can be analysed phenomenologically. It's obviously also something that can be considered normatively and analysed in terms of its socio-political implications or imperatives. And I want to argue further that this dissonance between the menstrual body and the contemporary world tends to be compounded by a lack of menstrual literacy in education and culture. It's probably worth saying before I get into the heart of the paper that there's all kinds of other possible aspects or dimensions or to explore when it comes to what might come under phenomenologies of the menstrual cycle that aren't going to be my focus here. The lived experience of someone's cycle, including disruptions to the cycle, might intersect with all other kinds of aspects of lived experience, including illness, injury, aging, gender identity, sexuality, fertility, different cultural or subcultural expectations. Each of those things constitute huge topics, and I think there's discussion around those things in many of the other papers in this conference. I'm not going to furrow into any of those different areas, but I'm going to keep my focus narrowed to the cycle as a form of lived temporality. So I want to start by zooming out and considering some of the connections between embodiment and temporality more generally, before coming back to think about the temporality of the menstrual cycle specifically. And I want to draw on the work of Henri Lefebvre and Thomas Fuchs. So to start with Lefebvre, most phenomenological analysis of temporality is focused on Husserl's form of time consciousness, but Lefebvre focuses on a conceptual and phenomenological analysis of temporality as rhythmic, which forms the basis of his project, which he calls rhythm analysis. The main idea here is that our lived experience is patterned rhythmically, which is to say, on Lefebvre's understanding, it has specific speeds, frequencies, consistencies, involving repetition and difference. He illustrates this primarily through lived examples, such as the paradigmatic example of listening to music as rhythmic, or participating in speech and dialogue as rhythmic. We experience different pieces of music and different languages as having different rhythms. But the lived experience of rhythm is not confined to those more obvious experiences of music and language, but is a constitutive feature of all of our experience. Lefebvre gives the example of the rhythms of a garden or the rhythms of a city such as in this quote, these kind of produce rhythms in our lived experience. And the rhythm of our lived subjectivity is sometimes faster and more frenetic, it's sometimes slower, sometimes more irregular, sometimes more evenly paced, but we're never without a rhythmic component or set of rhythmic components to our lived experience. Rhythms are lived through. And Lefebvre's project of rhythm analysis is an exhortation to pay attention to and study rhythms in order to, in his words, grasp them in their diversity, slow or fast, syncopated or continuous, interfering or distinct. And it might be more precise to say that our lived experience, which interact with each other in our lived experience. And Lefebvre designates this polyrhythmia. He also identifies the phenomena of eurythmia and arrhythmia, which are phenomena produced by the intersection of multiple rhythms interacting with each other in different ways in our lived experience. Eurythmia is the experience of rhythms interacting with each other in some kind of accordance, while arrhythmia refers to rhythms that in some way are out of sync with each other, or they're discordant. They break apart, as he puts it. And something that's interesting is that Lefebvre is explicit that this rhythmic component of lived temporality springs from our embodiment. He mentions explicitly, for example, the respiratory systems of breath in and out, the circadian rhythms of waking and sleeping, the bodily rhythms of hunger and thirst, the rhythms of the heart and the circulatory system. He takes these to be rhythms of the body which play a constitutive role in our lived temporal experience. Now, in a 2008 paper, Thomas Fuchs also explicitly considers the temporality of the lived body as having a rhythmic, specifically cyclic pattern. He also identifies, and quote, the periodic nature of physiological processes such as heartbeat, respiration, circadian rhythms, hormonal cycles, to the recurrent automatic actions and habits of the body, as all life lived in a pre-reflective way shaped by a cyclical structure. So Fuchs here is not just making an objective scientific point about the biology of the human body, but is making a point about how these rhythms of the body play a constitutive role in lived experience, specifically the temporal dimension of lived experience, which is a pre-reflexive component of subjective awareness. And another key part of Fuchs' analysis is that this fundamental cyclicity of the body finds itself in discordance with what he calls the linear conception of time that finds its shape in the scientific technological advances of modernity. He characterizes linear time in a few different ways. We might think of this as clock time, similar to the linear time or the cursive time described elsewhere by Julia Kristeva. Linear time is chronological time measured in identical units that move in one direction, this kind of steady march towards the future. In Fuchs' words, it's linear, uniform, and continually progressing. And Fuchs offers some historical diagnosis of some of the factors that led to this being the dominant form of temporality in modern Western culture. He cites the introduction of public mechanical clocks from 1350 onwards, as well as the capitalist principle of growth and acceleration that increasingly takes the place of traditional cyclical economics. And this latter point indicates another characteristic feature of linear time. It lends itself to a model of continual production and growth. Because linear time is characterized by a pattern of identical units following one another, there's a sense in which each unit of time has the same quality and can be employed for productivity in the same kind of way continuously, without pause, without change in tempo or And Fuchs makes much of the different rhythms of modernity's linear time and the body's cyclical time, arguing that the lived temporality of the body finds itself out of step in certain respects with the homogeneous march of linear time. Fuchs' point here is normative as well as descriptive, as he talks explicitly about the threat to health and well-being that can arise as a result of this kind of clash of lived temporalities. As in his words, this quote here, the relation of the two orders of time remains fundamentally precarious because in distinction to the linear processes, rhythmic cyclical processes cannot be accelerated at will. Repeatedly, we are faced with the threat of decouplings from natural bases and their limited or just cyclically renewed resources, be they of the biological environment or the individual in their body. Such decouplings of time or of time orders manifest themselves in ecological or economic crises, as well as in individual overexertion and illness. Now, Fuchs mentions hormonal cycles as one of the rhythms of lived embodiment, but he doesn't mention the menstrual cycle specifically, neither does Lefebvre. So in some respects, what I take myself to be doing here is taking Fuchs' analysis and extending it to think specifically about the cyclical rhythm of the menstrual cycle, which I turn to now. And of course, there's a socio-political aspect to this, as the menstrual cycle is a rhythm of the body that affects women and girls, those who menstruate. So I want to consider aspects of the variable but identifiable lived rhythm of the phases of pre-ovulation, ovulation, pre-menstruation, and menstruation that make up the repeating pattern of the menstrual cycle. There's kind of key hormonal and physical changes that form the biological basis of that pattern, and then also some sort of archetypal mood and energy experiences to the environmental affordances that are part of this kind of rhythm as well. I think it's worth being really explicit that there's no such thing as the menstrual cycle with the definite article, and that applies to both the biological pattern and to the lived experience. The kind of, if you like, the archetypal menstrual cycle is 28 days long, with these kind of neat divisions into the 4 quadrants that I've mentioned. But in reality, lived experience is much less tidy. Most people's menstrual cycle fluctuates and varies across cycles. There's real variance from person to person. Some women have really irregular cycles due to ongoing health issues or other factors. Those on hormonal birth control may have a really different shape to their cycle or no cycle at all. So this isn't about trying to capture some kind of essential menstrual experience, but rather making use of the archetypal form as a frame and a guide and language to aid phenomenological description of individual lived experience, which will vary, in order to try to understand the basic form of cyclical temporality at play here. So that said, really broadly, there are these 2 phases to the menstrual cycle, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, and each of these phases can be split into 2. The follicular phase, luteal phase, includes pre-menstruation and menstruation. The first day of the cycle is the day that menstruation starts. So the menstrual phase is typically, again, it varies, but typically between day 1 and day 5. That's the menstrual bleed. During the pre-ovulatory phase, again, roughly day 6 to 11, the hormone estrogen starts to rise, and a new ovum or egg starts to mature. The ovulation window is just 1 day in the cycle, archetypally day 14, but typically somewhere between days 12 and 18. And then after the egg has been released, levels of the hormone progesterone start to increase, which is the start of the premenstrual phase, which is typically around days 19 to 28. So in thinking about the phenomenal quality of the lived experience of the menstrual cycle, I'm drawing on some of the work of those in the menstrual cycle awareness movement, a practice of attending to the lived experience of moods and energies in each quadrant of the cycle. So this is kind of a popular grassroots movement rather than a piece of academic research. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done kind of empirically, philosophically in the academy to kind of look at this. But I think this movement provides impetus for further academic interrogation. What you're getting is lots of people generating, if you like, phenomenological data, reporting on their own lived experience. So the idea with menstrual cycle awareness is paying attention to things like mood, energy, thought patterns, pain, sex drive, all of these things to sort of then, so that women can start to notice kind of patterns in their lived experience. And the founders of this sort of movement of menstrual cycle awareness, Alexandra Pope and Shani Hugo Wurlitzer, use the metaphor of the 4 seasons to gesture towards the typical phenomenal qualities of energy, mood, and affordance in the different quadrants of the cycle. So pre-ovulation is spring, ovulation is summer, premenstruation is autumn, and menstruation is winter. So the thought here is that as people cycle through these kind of different changes in energy, so the archetypal sort of spring energy, they say, is characterized by more imagination and possibility, surging life, after the lower energy of the bleed. During the ovulation phase, people are more likely to have a proclivity for sociability, to have more energy. Archetypally, the premenstrual phase is kind of more critical, focused towards refining or consolidating things. And the menstrual phase is a kind of time of lower energy, the time that the body generally wants to move more slowly, wants to rest. They describe this as a time for reflection, introspection, and rest. So this is extremely kind of broad brushstroke, but nevertheless, if there's some kind of broad pattern that's evident here, for those with a menstrual cycle, there's a lived rhythm of the body that unfolds and repeats with repetition and difference over time. And even for those for whom this cyclical pattern remains at the level, it's not something that's reflected on consciously, this pattern of the body remains a constitutive component of their lived temporality, contributing to the polyrhythmia of their body. So having, where I probably only have a couple more minutes, but having kind of laid out that sort of idea of there being a kind of lived rhythm of the body for those with a menstrual cycle, we can think again about Fuchs's point about the clash between the cyclical body and linear time. When it comes to writing a presentation for a conference, for example, working with the grain of this rhythm might best place the ideas generation phase during the pre-ovulatory phase, writing the first draft in the ovulation phase, editing during the premenstrual phase, and then resting during the menstrual phase. However, as we've considered, the dominant paradigm of temporality in our culture, certainly when it comes to work, is linear time, which treats each unit of time as the same, equally good for producing and producing in the same way. There's therefore not a huge amount of structural flexibility for many women and girls to intentionally work with this natural rhythm of their body, and indeed many often find themselves working against it. Many are in situations where they're working and producing in accordance with the dominant pattern of linear time, which may produce forms of arrhythmia in lived experience, even if this is pre-reflective. And we can return to Fuchs's caution about the ill effects of discordant rhythms on human well-being to minimally pose the question as to what the cost of this arrhythmia might be to women's health and well-being. I think I should probably end there. I think it's worth saying that menstrual literacy is on the rise at the moment. We are seeing, with the menstrual cycle awareness and the rise of kind of period tracking apps and the like, some more equipping around this this kind of knowledge, which I think will be interesting to see how that plays out. But I'll close there. Thank you so much for listening.